of our Adult Education Committee scholars and residents via Zoom. Mirza Hashem, soon enough we'll be able to do these in person as well. It'd be nice to not only see the faces on the screen, but back in shul. Mirza Hashem soon. So Rabbi Dr. David Shabtai is an old friend. We had the privilege of learning in yeshiva at the same time and being neighbors in 160 Bennett Avenue in the good old days. Interestingly, as rabbi doctors go, his doctor is not a PhD, but an MD. And he has a fascinating work that he has written on brain death and his expertise in general. I remember soon after moving into Teaneck, we had, Shoshana, actually. No, it wasn't. I don't remember anymore. Okay, one of my children fell on a Shabbos afternoon, and a very interesting question related to stitching it up or waiting until after Shabbos and discussing it at length with Rabbi Dr. Shabtai, who was able to get in touch with the Nishmas Avram, with Professor Abraham, who had a very different take on it than I did, and was a learning experience, as always is the case when dealing with, again, very interesting learned people such as Rabbi Shabtai. Today, he's the Sephardic rabbi at the Boca Raton Synagogue, apparently teaches high school as well, as from his Zoom experience, and has written a new book on Megillat Esther. I have an affinity towards Megillat Esther. I have unfortunately not had a chance to look at the book yet, but we will hopefully have the opportunity to hear some of the themes of the book. There's still time to purchase it. Is it at the Judaic House? Presumably it's at the Judaic House. All good Judaic. Yeah, why not? It probably is there. Reach out to the Neowitzes. If not, then I'm sure they can get it. If not, on Amazon, probably. Like, okay. Anything that's not at the Judaic House is probably at Amazon. So again, really, I don't want to take up too much of the time, but it's really a special personal kavod and kavod for our shul to be able to have Rabbi Dr. Shabtai present us on Hiding in Plain Sight, the story behind Megillat Esther. B'chavod.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Zatz. Thank you so much for having me. Please let me know if there's any issues with the technical part. I'm trying to do it with a Zoom kind of so I can show slides as well. It is a pleasure to speak something not about end of life or COVID. So Baruch Hashem. And I also have an affinity for Megillat Esther, apparently. And over the years, I taught it for many years, and I really just started putting it all together. And so I just published my sefer on it's called Hiding in Plain Sight. You can indeed get it on Amazon. I do not know if it's available at Judaic House in Teaneck, but certainly on Amazon. It's supposed to be released tomorrow. I'm told that in some parts of the country it's cold and snowing. We wouldn't know about that over here, and so that's delaying shipments. Not to make anyone jealous, but I am sitting outside, and it's in the lower 70s. So for us, that's a little bit chilly. But with that, let's begin. So it is a little bit hard to talk about a new book because I sort of want to give you a taste for it, but not the whole thing because I didn't really dive in. So I want to talk a little bit about it, a little bit from the outside, and try with doing something a little bit somewhat silly at the beginning. Because if I would start to talk about Purim, something like this, and this would be the first couple of minutes that you saw of me, so you likely wouldn't take me very seriously. And it's interesting because our first encounter for most of us with Megillat Esther, our first impression is usually, for many of us, preschool, kindergarten, elementary school. And we encounter the story as kids, and superficially, it's a simple story. There's a king who seems foolish. There's a person who hates us, wants to kill us. Esther saves the day. Let's eat. And there are all these funny elements that get mixed in. But for most of us, me included, I never really read Megillat Esther. I've even lamed it, but I've never actually read it inside to care about what is actually going on. Like we read other Sfarim in Tanakh, because indeed it is a Sefer of Tanakh. And when we read it, it's somewhat, it does strike somewhat differently than the story that I at least recall being told in kindergarten, in preschool, through elementary school, and even much of high school. And there's a lot going on there. It's one of the more rich stories in Tanakh. And in fact, it's one of those stories where the telling of the story itself is incorporated into the story. Because at the end of the Megillah, so Mordechai and Esther write the story, and they send it to everybody to accept upon themselves this new holiday of Purim. And in fact, Megillat Esther is the last book to make it into Tanakh. From a chronological perspective, Megillat Esther is the last book to make it in. We know we have 24 books of Tanakh, and we sort of take it for granted that Megillat Esther is one of them, but that wasn't always the case. In fact, the Gemara has a debate. It mentions Rav Shmuel Bar Yehuda, Amar Rav Shmuel Bar Yehuda, Shalcha lahem Esther l'chachamim kavuni l'doros. That Esther Hamalka had to petition the Chachamim to include Megillat Esther among the Kisvei HaKodesh, that it wasn't obvious that it would make it in. Indeed, it is the last book, and the Gemara says that the Perek in Tehillim, Perek of Beis, that's attributed to Esther Hamalka, Alam Natseach Ala Yelas HaShachar, that Ayelas HaShachar is the end of the night, so too Esther is the last of the miracles. And the Gemara says, what do you mean last of the miracles? So you have to figure out, when did Megillat Esther take place? When did the story of Purim take place? So the story of Purim took place in between the two Batei Mikdash, after the destruction of the first Beis HaMikdash, and right before the rebuilding of the second Beis HaMikdash. That's when it takes place. So the Gemara says, that's a little bit strange. It's not the last miracle. The Hanukkah story happened about 200 years later. So he said, no. This is the last story. This is the last story that was written, that was meant to be put in to the Tanakh. This is the last miracle that happened to Am Yisrael that was then put into the Tanakh. And it's interesting where this story is when you think about it chronologically. Now, when we learned the Megillah, when I was presented with the Megillah, so okay, Jews are in Paras. It doesn't really make much of a mention of Yerushalayim at all. It doesn't make mention of Jewish history at all. It sort of seems ahistorical. It could have happened at any time in history. Some nation wants to destroy the Jewish people. That's unfortunately something that we're used to. And, someone saved the day. These things happen, and it could have happened any time at all. But when you read the larger context, because Mordechai and Esther assumed for a moment that we know actually what's going on, and the opening pasuk in the Megillah, Vayihi b'mei Achashverosh, hu Achashverosh, they're referring to an Achashverosh that we are familiar with. Now, which Achashverosh are we familiar with? So he appears in Sefer Ezra. Now, unfortunately, much of Sefer Ezra is written in Aramaic. And unfortunately, even for those of us who might be familiar with Aramaic from Gemara, the Aramaic of the Sefer Ezra is slightly different than the Aramaic of the Gemara, and it makes it very difficult to get through. And so we tend not to teach it in school because it's really hard. And we tend not to learn it so much on our own because it's frankly hard. But if you read it, Sefer Ezra starts off with Koresh Melech Paras. It's starting off with, in the middle, after the destruction of the first Beis HaMikdash, Koresh, the king of Paras, says, God has given me all this land. He's non-Jewish king of Paras. He recognized that Hashem gave him all this land. I want to build a Beis HaMikdash. I want to give the Jews the permission to build a Beis HaMikdash. And not only that, he sends the Jews back, and he says, he's the inheritor of the Babylonian kingdom, of Nebuchadnezzar's heritage, who destroyed the first Beis HaMikdash. So he has all these kalim from the Beis HaMikdash. He's like, you know what? Take it. Take everything and go. Go rebuild the Beis HaMikdash. And not so many Jews go. And he says, okay, for the Jews who don't go, at least support them financially. He helps with the fundraising. And he helps them build the Beis HaMikdash. And they encounter a lot of problems when they get there. Not so many people go. There are some technical problems, physical problems. They can't build it. And the locals are really unhappy that the Jews are building the Beis HaMikdash, and they're trying to get them to stop, and they're trying to pressure the Persian government to get them to stop, and it's not working. And they can't really get their acts together. They just start until finally they are able to pressure the Persian government to stop the building of the Beis HaMikdash. But it's not Koresh who stops the building of the Beis HaMikdash. He's the one who gave permission to build it. And it's not his son Daryavesh. Rather, it's the third Persian king, Achashverosh. Achashverosh is appealed to by the locals in Eretz Yisrael, who say, look, this is terrible. The Jews having their own country, they're going to rebel. They're going to have this Beis HaMikdash, Yerushalayim. They describe it in such a fascinating perspective. Yerushalayim is this city that's rebellious. It never does anything that anybody wants. It's always independent, which we take as a sense of pride. But for the non-Jewish conqueror, it's a little bit difficult. And he says, if you allow them to build this Beis HaMikdash, they're going to rebel. They're not going to pay taxes. It's going to be terrible. And Achashverosh stops the building of the Beis HaMikdash. This is Achashverosh that we're familiar with the Megillah, who stops the building of the Beis HaMikdash. And none of that's mentioned in Megillah Esther. But all the Jews in Shushan knew that this had just happened. Achashverosh was very much not their friend. But why did he stop the building of the Beis HaMikdash? It's a little bit complicated politically, but he definitely stopped the building of the Beis HaMikdash. And it's interesting because in Sefer Ezra, one of the other features of Sefer Ezra, which makes it so not amenable to teaching in school, is that there are lists and lists and lists of names who came and who went and who was in charge, and frankly can be a little bit dry. But one name stands out. Many names might stand out, but one stands out to me, and that's Mordechai Bilshan. The name Mordechai only appears one other time in Tanakh, and that's Mordechai in the Megillah. That there was this man, Mordechai, who went to Yerushalayim to help rebuild the Beit HaMikdash, and now he appears in Shushan, one of Achashverosh's ministers. And it's a little bit strange, but once you realize that background, it colors how we relate to the Jews' relationship to Achashverosh. When he invites them to the party at the beginning, their relationship is a little bit tenuous. Achashverosh just stopped the building of the Beit HaMikdash. Now, these are Persian Jews who seemingly did not go with Ezra HaSofer to rebuild the Beit HaMikdash, so they're staying back, but they realize that something's going on here. It changes everything. It's only Achashverosh, his son, Daryavish, his son from Esther Hamalka, who finally allows the continuation of the building of the Beit HaMikdash. It's one of the ways that Megillas Esther is actually the fulfillment of the building of the Beit HaMikdash. It sets into motion the rebuilding of the second Beit HaMikdash. And it's interesting, getting back to the context here, that Megillas Esther is the last book chronologically to make it into Tanakh. Again, Sefer Ezra refers to events that happened later, but apparently it was more obvious for Megillas Esther for Sefer Ezra to make it into Tanakh. Megillas Esther was a little bit less clear. And that same Gemara in Shabbos later on in Megillah, later on that page, has a debate whether actually Megillas Esther should be part of Tanakh. And there's a debate whether, and in the language of the Gemara, is it mitamei adayim or not mitamei adayim, which is the Gemara's way of saying, is it part of the Kitvei HaKodesh or not part of the Kitvei HaKodesh? And it's somewhat strange. We take it for granted that it's part of Tanakh. But apparently, this was somewhat speculative at the time. And generally speaking, there are two reasons given that it's not necessarily assumed to be part of Tanakh, and both tell us a tremendous amount about the story of Megillas Esther, the lesson that it's supposed to teach us. And the first is that, frankly, yes, it's a story about the Jewish people, but it's not a very Jewish story. So what do I mean by that? I don't know, Jews talk about God. Jews mention God. Jews daven. Jews something. There is very, very, very little to any religious content, Jewish religious content in the Megillah. The closest we get is that Esther Hamalka asks for a fast day, and we know that a fast day is supposed to be a Yom Tefillah, but it doesn't mention that at all. There's no mention of Tefillah. It's Vitsumu Alai. She asks the people of Shushan to fast. At the end of the Megillah, when they establish the holiday of Purim, there's a mention of making Purim into a Yom Tov, which is not accepted by the people. And in the end, they make it as a non-Yom Tov. We have it as a non-Yom Tov. You're allowed to do Malacha on Purim Day. But there's very, very, very little religious content at all. For a book of Tanakh, there are only two that don't mention God's name. One is Shir HaShirim, and one is Megillas Esther. And given the Shir HaShirim has a more esoteric, mystical context, one could assume that maybe that's why it got in. But Megillas Esther is just a story. It's a history. It's fascinating, but it doesn't make any mention of God whatsoever. So maybe that was part of the tension, and we'll get back to that a little bit later. Alternatively, is that if it is actually the last book chronologically to make it in, maybe it just frankly wasn't meant to be part of the Torah Shebechsav. It wasn't meant to be part of the Torah Shebechsav. So we know that when HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave Moshe Rabbeinu the Torah at Har Sinai, he gave him the Torah Shebechsav, what we know as the Torah, and the Torah Shebe'al Peh, which was the oral tradition, which now we have written down as the Mishnah and the Gemara, but for hundreds of years was oral. It means it didn't exist on paper. It only existed when it was taught. And so the Torah Shebe'al Peh and the Torah Shebechsav were two separate entities, and maybe Megillas Esther was not meant to be part of the Torah Shebechsav. So why should that be? So now there's a fascinating Gemara in Shabbos, a Gemara that many of us are familiar with, but it's interesting to see. The pasuk says, when Bnei Israel come to Har Sinai, they stand at the base of the mountain, but betachtit, has the connotation we translate it as the base of the mountain, at the foot of the mountain, but tachtit means really on the underside of the mountain. Amar Rav Avdimi bar Chama bar Chasam Alamik Shekaf HaKadosh Baruch Hu Alemet Har Kigigit. That famous Gemara, the famous Ma'amar Chazal, that indeed Bnei Israel were underneath the mountain, and Hashem lifted the mountain on top of them and held it upon them. V'amar lahem, Im atem mekablim et haTorah mutav. If you accept the Torah, so that's great. V'im lav, sham teik v'raschem. And if you say no, the mountain may fall. And so Bnei Israel famously say Nasav Nishma, and they accept the Torah. It's an offer that they cannot refuse. But the Gemara says, Amar Ravacha bar Yaakov mikan moda Rabba le'oraisa. Gemara says, wait a minute. If they accepted the Torah only because they were forced to do so, so that's not a real acceptance. If I'm forced into a deal, am I going to be held responsible and accountable for all the aspects and all the details of executing that deal or no? If you forced me into something, maybe that lowers my level of accountability and responsibility. And indeed, the Gemara talks about this in the context of sales and other things. But here, the Gemara says, well, wait a minute. Anyone can come along later and say, yeah, don't hold me accountable. Why didn't I do this? Why didn't I keep this mitzvah? Why didn't I keep that mitzvah? I never wanted to be part of this to begin with. You forced me. What do you want from me? I don't want this. You forced me. And the Gemara seems to think this is an excellent question, because the Gemara counters with, yeah, that could have been a big problem, but Amarava, Afal Pichein, Hader Kiblu Abimeach Hashverosh. That in fact it's true. The Jews were forced to accept the Torah at Har Sinai, but after the Purim story, Bimeach Hashverosh, they accepted it willingly. How do we know? The Chsiv, it says in the pasuk at the very end of the Megillah, Kimu v'kiblu haYehudim. When the Jews finally accepted, after Mordechai convinces them to accept the holiday of Purim, it uses a double language to describe their acceptance. Kimu v'kiblu. So why a double language? The Gemara says, Kimu mash v'kiblu kvar. They now accepted willingly that which they accepted by coercively previously. Now they willingly accepted this Torah shebe'al peh. And the question is, okay, where does it say Torah shebe'al peh? Where does it say Torah shebechsav? It doesn't actually say any of this. This is, in fact, the Maharal in his commentary to the Megillah. Has a commentary called the Or Chadash. In fact, this was my first really foray into exploring the Megillah in more context, and in fact, into the thought of Maharal. Maharal has an excellent commentary called the Or Chadash, and if you're interested in it, I would strongly recommend it with the super commentary of Rabbi Hartman. He has the Maharal is sometimes one or two lines at the top, and Rabbi Hartman has footnotes and footnotes and footnotes explaining exactly what the Maharal said. But he has a fascinating approach to the Megillah, and he quotes a Yalkut Shimoni. He says, in fact, what happened at Har Sinai was that Hashem presented them the Torah, and Bnei Israel heard it, and they said, makes sense. And they heard the Torah Shebechsav, and they're like, you know what? This makes sense. It tells you exactly what to do. And we're okay with doing it. But this Torah Sheba'al Peh, we're not so sure about. Meaning, when it comes to Hilchos Shabbos, so it says, don't do work on Shabbos. Lo ta'aseh kol malacha. Sounds reasonable. We won't go to work. And then the Torah Sheba'al Peh comes and says, but let me explain to you what I mean by work. Work isn't just going into your office. Work is these 39 categories and avos and tolados and all sorts of things going on, and a lot of details of this. We're like, ooh, Torah Shebechsav, we're okay with. Torah Sheba'al Peh, not so sure. And that's what Hashem had to force them to accept. At Har Sinai, Hashem forced them to accept the Torah Sheba'al Peh. The Torah Shebechsav, they accepted willingly. And the Torah Sheba'al Peh, that's what he forced them to accept. And after the Purim story, what they accepted willingly was the Torah Sheba'al Peh. Meaning, they had already accepted the Torah Shebechsav. They were forced to accept the Torah Sheba'al Peh, and they were doing it. They were following it, but at the Purim story, after Bimeach Hashverosh, Hadar Kiblua Bimeach Hashverosh, that is when they already began to accept the Torah Sheba'al Peh willingly. And the Maharal wonders that's a beautiful medrash. It makes a lot of sense on some level. It explains the Gemara really well. It explains what's going on. And Kimu v'kiblu, I understand that it says they accepted that which they accepted already, but where do you see a concept of Torah Sheba'al Peh? And he points out the following. Purim is a mitzvah d'Rabbanan. Well, obviously, it's not written in the Torah anywhere. So Purim is a mitzvah d'Rabbanan. And Bnei Israel willingly accept to make a new mitzvah. So how does that exactly fit in? And Maharal doesn't quote this, but Rav Shabtai quotes this all the time, that The Rambam, in his introduction to the Mishnah, says, there are 5 categories of Torah Sheba'al Peh. Torah Sheba'al Peh can be fit into 5 different categories. One is definitions, one is halacha l'moshe misinai, rules that have no source in the Torah whatsoever. And then the third category is the midos shaTorah nidreshes b'hem. We say every morning the brayso of Rabbi Shmuel Omer, kal v'chomer, gzeira shava. How do we learn one thing from another? And categories 4 and 5 of Torah Sheba'al Peh are the mitzvos midrabanan, the positive mitzvos, and the forbidden things that we're not allowed to do midrabanan, all form part of the tapestry of Torah Sheba'al Peh. When Chazal make a rule, it becomes part of Torah Sheba'al Peh. It's an expansion of Torah Sheba'al Peh. So the Maharal says, when Bnei Israel willingly accepted Purim as a holiday, they willingly expanded the Torah Sheba'al Peh. If they're willing to expand the Torah Sheba'al Peh, it must be that they now willingly accepted the Torah Sheba'al Peh. And Purim is the story, therefore, of accepting the Torah Sheba'al Peh. And if that's true, then perhaps the Megillah, which is the story of the acceptance of the Torah Sheba'al Peh, should be part of Torah Sheba'al Peh. And in fact, should not be part of Torah Shebechsav. And in fact, that's what the machlokas in the Gemara is. Should it be part of the Kisvei HaKodesh, part of Tanakh, meaning part of Torah Shebechsav, or part of Torah Sheba'al Peh? So it makes a lot of sense that it should be part of the Torah Sheba'al Peh. So why, in the end, we know that it's part of Torah Shebechsav? So why should that be? So Rav Shabtai gives a wonderful explanation. He says, when Bnei Israel accepted the Torah, in Parashas Kisisa, when it says, Bnei Israel said, Na'aseh v'nishma, and according to this Gemara and this Maharal, the Elkot Shimoni, they're accepting the Torah Shebechsav. Before they say that, there's a covenant. And not only is there a covenant, there's a Sefer Habrit. There's a Sefer Habrit that Moshe reads to Bnei Israel before they agree to accept it. So what is this book of the covenant that Bnei Israel agreed to? And so Rashi there says that it's all of Torah up until Ma'amad Har Sinai. It's from Parshas Bereishis until Parshas Yitro. It's the whole story. It's how Bnei Israel came to this point. It's the history of how we got here. And the history of how we got here needs to be part of that covenant. And there needed to be a Sefer Habrit, a written covenant that says how we got to this point. And then Bnei Israel were able to accept the Torah. So too, when Bnei Israel were able to accept the Torah Sheba'al Peh, they also needed a Sefer Habrit. They needed a written covenant that describes how they came to where they are. And that's what Megillat Esther is. Megillat Esther is the Sefer Habrit, the story of how Bnei Israel came to accept the Torah Sheba'al Peh at the end of the story of Purim. And in fact, if you look at the halachos of how a Megillah has to be written, well, on the face of it, it looks a little bit like a Sefer Torah. It has to be written on cloth, one long piece of parchment that's rolled, and it has to be written b'dio, b'ksav ashuris. But the details of it are somewhat different. They're not exactly the same as Torah because it straddles the fence between Torah Shebechsav and Torah Sheba'al Peh. So the strict rules of what qualifies as Torah Shebechsav don't necessarily apply to the Megillah. There are different rules that apply to how it has to be written. So for example, if you're missing a letter, you're missing a word, or you're even missing up to half the words in the Megillah, it's still kosher. Whereas if you're missing one letter in the Sefer Torah, it's not. Although technically the Megillah is part of Torah Shebechsav, because it straddles that fence between Torah Shebechsav and Torah Sheba'al Peh, there are some rules that are relaxed. And even though it's not exactly fitting the criteria of what needs to be in a Sefer Torah, nonetheless, the rules of Torah Sheba'al Peh sort of take control of how that Megillah has to be written. And while that's true, there needs to be a deeper message. Why is that, though? What is it about the story of the Megillah? And I understand that the story of the Megillah leads them up to accepting the Purim holiday, and they accepted the Purim holiday. The Maharal explains to us is an expansion of the story of the mitzvah d'Rabbanan. If it's an expansive mitzvah d'Rabbanan, it's an expansion of Torah Sheba'al Peh. But why? What is it? And therefore, you need a story. You need a Sefer Habris. You need a story that gets you there. You need a story that explains how they got there. But what is it about the story of Purim that really gets to the point that Bnei Israel said, okay, it makes sense now to expand the Torah Sheba'al Peh. It makes sense now to accept it willingly. Even if technically it works out, what is it about the story? And if you look, we mentioned in the Megillah, there's not very much Jewish content. And if you look at all the words in the Megillah, you can do a word cloud and see the words in the Megillah. So some of those, this is a word cloud. It gives you, plug in the whole Megillah, and it tells you which words appear more frequently than others. And, it makes sense. Esther, Haman, Hamalka, Mordechai, Hamelech. The word Hamelech appears more than any other word in the Megillah. But if you look at this whole word cloud and you look throughout the entire Megillah, you will notice that one word is missing, and that's the name of Hashem. Hashem's name appears nowhere in the Megillah. In fact, when the Gemara in Chulin Kuf Lametes wants to know Esther min HaTorah minala, and it's looking for a hint to Megillas Esther in the Torah. Now, it's not clearly looking for the story of Megillas Esther in the Torah. The story of Purim happened 1,000 years after the Torah was given. So when it asks Esther min HaTorah minalan, where do we find a hint to Megillas Esther? It's only a hint. It's something clever. And it quotes a pasuk, Anochi haster astir panai bayomahu. It's Hashem talking that when Bnei Israel will sin, Anochi haster astir panai, I will hide my face. And so how does that relate to the story of Esther? So on the face of it, haster astir sounds like Esther. It's the same words, same letters. Esther, Hester, it sounds the same. And therefore you find a hint to Megillas Esther in the Torah. But some Mefarshim point to something deeper. Anochi haster astir panai, I will hide my face, meaning in the story of the Megillah, Hashem's name will not appear. Hashem's face will be hidden, his face, his name, that by which we know him. We know that which he does in the Megillah will be hidden. And in fact, not only is there no mention of his name, there's no mention of him whatsoever. Esther Hamalka never appeals to Hashem. The Mefarshim explain that she davened and Chazal have to tell us that what she said was the Mizmor of Tehillim Kaf Beis, Aili Eli Lama Zavtani. And if you look at the Targum Sheni, it's a early commentary on Megillas Esther. It includes lots of tefillos that were said in Am Yisrael and Esther Hamalka, but the Megillah itself leaves all of that out. And when we're talking about telling the story of the Megillah, it's Mordechai and Esther who are writing the story. Now, we assume that it is indeed part of the Torah Shebechsav. And if it is indeed part of the Torah Shebechsav, the Gemara Megillah tells us that it must have been written Beruach HaKodesh. It's not just you or I writing a book. This is a book that's written Beruach HaKodesh. But unlike Torah, which was dictated word for word, letter for letter from God, this was not. Written Beruach HaKodesh means it was divinely inspired, but it was written by Mordechai and Esther with a particular motive in mind. And they specifically left out any mention of God. Now, famously, there's the Ibn Ezra in one place quotes Rav Sadia Gaon who says, yeah, you know why? Because Mordechai and Esther really wrote this book for the Persians. This was a book that was going to be published in Shushan, in Paras, and you didn't want to appeal to God too much. It wouldn't speak to them so much. But other Mefarshim say, okay, but that's fine. But then why did we include it in Tanakh? We included it in Tanakh because it was written for us. So you're right, it could have been written for them, but most Mefarshim assume it was written for us. Yes, they could read it also. But if it's written for us, so then why not put in God's name? And it's deliberate. Mordechai and Esther are trying to teach us something fundamental. And what I've come to discover in teaching about the Megillah and learning about the Megillah and Purim is that the focus of the story, the focus of the lesson of the Megillah, and frankly, so much of that which is associated with Purim is about to see the hidden Yad Hashem in this world. We're supposed to look for the Yad Hashem, God's hand, when it is not obvious. That's our job. That's the lesson from the Megillah, to see God's hand in this world. And not only that, but in the Megillah itself, Esther Hamalka and the Jews do this very thing. They come to realize that God is really running the show. And when they realize that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is running the show, they change tactics. They change that which they're going to do. They recognize that HaKadosh Baruch Hu, there's Yad Hashem in the world, and they change that which they're doing. They react differently. They take the reins, and they realize that there's a role to play, that God has meaning in that which he's doing. They found the Yad Hashem. They react. And so to us, we're not supposed to learn it. We're supposed to see that they did it. And that's the point of the Megillah. And that's much of that which has to do with Purim as well. And so Mordechai and Esther wanted specifically to leave Hashem's name out, to show us that sometimes he's hiding beneath the surface. Sometimes it's up to us to uncover it, to scratch beneath that surface and to realize that which is going on. So just a couple of examples, because I don't want to give away the whole book. So one example is when Mordechai is trying to convince Esther to speak to Achashverosh. So a little background. Haman convinces Achashverosh to kill the Jewish people. Achashverosh wholeheartedly agrees. Haman even offers him money. And Achashverosh is like, nah, not necessary. Akasef natulach. Keep the money. I don't need it. Kill the people. Interestingly, by the way, you'll notice in that conversation, not part of our topic right now, but that Haman never actually tells Achashverosh that it's the Jewish people. He says, Yesh no am echad mifuzarim farad ben hamim. There's this one nation. And more interestingly than the fact that Haman never tells Achashverosh which nation he wants to destroy, Achashverosh isn't interested in finding out. He never asks him either. Fascinating, because if you play that out till the end of the story, it changes something. But Haman convinces Achashverosh that he wants to wipe out the Jewish people, puts up plaques all over Shushan. This is going to happen. Now, Mordechai needs to let Esther know. Esther's in the palace. She is not aware. So Mordechai talks to Hatach, who's this go-between between him and Esther, because people don't realize that they're actually related. So Mordechai tells Hatach to tell Esther, Et kol asher karahu, tell Esther everything that happened. Ved parashat kesef asher Haman liskol ginzei hamelech bayudim la'abdam, and tell her about the money that Achashverosh turned down the money. Haman offered to pay off Achashverosh, to bribe him to kill the Jews, and Achashverosh wasn't interested. So most of the Mepharshim explain that this is a dire situation, because, and one of the positions I take in this book is that Achashverosh is not a stupid man. We're always taught that Achashverosh is a fool, and if you read the Megillah carefully, he's very, very politically astute. Where do we even get the idea that Achashverosh is a fool? So it's a Gemara, it's Machlokas Rav and Shmuel. Achashverosh melech chacham haya or melech pikech haya or melech tipesh haya. Was he smart or a fool? And so he's a fool. But if you look at the Machlokas, what they're actually arguing about is political science. Should he have played this group against that group or this group against that group? One assumes that he was politically savvy. One assumes he made a political error. But it's all about him being, how politically savvy was he? And did he make a mistake in calculating his politics? That's the machlokas, whether Achashverosh was a fool, but otherwise he's politically astute the whole time. So when Achashverosh refuses the money, Mordechai is trying to tell Esther, our situation is dire. Don't think we're going to be able to bribe Achashverosh off here. And he says that he gave Hatach, Mordechai gives Hatach the proclamation that was put up in Shushan to show her this is what's happening. She should come to the king. That she should go to the king and beg for mercy on her nation. The Jews are going to be killed, and she has the ability to save them. She needs to go to the king. And Esther responds. Vatomer Esther lahatach v'tetzaveh Mordechai through Hatach. She's like, whoa. She doesn't even address the point. Not proclamation, not Haman, not money, not Jewish people. Kol avdei hamelech asher ve'am medinos hamelech yodim asher kol ish v'isha asher yavo al hamelech al chatzer pnimit asher lo yikarei achad dato lahamit. You can't go speak to Achashverosh. No one's able to just walk in. You want me to go and beg? It's not going to listen to me. No one's allowed in. Everyone knows that you walk in, you die. Unless he, the king, reaches out with his scepter. Shows a little bit of the politics, a little bit of the character of Achashverosh, also a little bit in here. Not for now, but something to explore further. Va'ani, Esther saying, me, Loni Kresi Laval Amelach Zesh Shloshim Yom. I wasn't even called in for the last month. He's not terribly interested in seeing me. If he was interested in seeing me, then maybe I could go. And some of them first saying, you know what? Mordechai, I'll speak to him. But I'm not going to go and approach him. At some point, he'll call me. And some of them first says, wait a minute. Let's think about timing. Where are we holding right now? So somewhat of a machlokas, exactly the dating seems to be Erev Pesach, Yud Daled Nisan. And when does the proclamation say we should kill the Jews? The Persians should kill the Jews? Yud Gimel Adar. It's a full 11 months away. So Esther says, look, What's the rush to go now? If I walk into Achashverosh now, I'm risking my life. And who knows if I'll get anything out of it. You know what? Let me just wait. He hasn't called me for a month already. At some point, he'll call me the next day, the next week, the next month. And we have plenty of time. Don't worry about it. I'll go speak to him then. But fascinating, she doesn't address the point at all. She doesn't mention anything about what Mordechai asked her to do. There's no reaction. She doesn't even seem shocked. She's not worried. She's worried about herself, how she's going to get to the king. She's going to be killed. And Mordechai responds if I was writing the Megillah, or if I was Mordechai, try to put myself in the character's shoes, something we don't really do, because again, we come to the Megillah with these preconceptions about how the story's supposed to go and what's supposed to happen. But if I was Mordechai, I would want to give Esther a pep rally right now. Esther, you got this. You can do it. We're counting on you. Come on, make a difference. You can do this. Boost her up. That's what I think, certainly in 2021, what we would do. You want to give someone full of confidence. And Mordechai says, "V'yomer Mordechai lashiv el Esther, al tedami b'nafshech li'maleit beit hamelech mikol Yehudim." Because I know what you're thinking. You're thinking you're in the palace. You're in the castle. Even if there's an edict to just kill all the Jews, you're going to be safe. You're going to be safe. Not only that, Mordechai knows full well that Achashverosh doesn't know that Esther's Jewish. So even if there's an edict to kill all the Jews, no one knows Esther's Jewish. And presumably, if Achashverosh doesn't know that Esther's Jewish, Haman also doesn't know that Esther's Jewish. How would he know? And if you think about it for a moment, if Haman knew that Esther was Jewish, it wouldn't be so smart to want to kill the queen. Remember, Chazal tell us that Haman did that already once. The very beginning of the Megillah, when Achashverosh needs to deal with Vashti, the Megillah says that Mimuchan, one of the ministers, speaks up and says, let's get rid of Vashti. Either kill her, banish her, machlokas. But let's get rid of Vashti. And the Gemara tells us that Mimuchan is Haman. He tried that plot already once. Probably not the best idea to try to get rid of the queen a second time without some type of a provocation. So Mordechai saying, I know you don't want to risk your life because you'll be okay. If you stay quiet, don't worry about it. The Jewish story will not end in Shushan. The Jewish story does not end in Shushan. Mordechai is making a statement of faith. He has full emunah, netzach Yisrael lo yishaker. HaKadosh Baruch Hu will come to our saving. He will save us. The Jewish story will not end. Judaism will continue. The Jewish people will continue. It might wipe up a big chunk of us. But we will continue. And no one will remember you anymore. So don't worry about it. If you don't go, it'll be okay. If you don't go, HaKadosh Baruch Hu has other ways of taking care of Haman. He has other ways of making this work. Don't worry. Now, it doesn't sound terribly motivating. But Esther hears this and jumps into action. So what was it exactly that Mordechai was conveying to Esther? What was it that changed? Don't worry. If it's not you, it'll be someone else. Don't worry. Hashem's got this. The Jewish story doesn't end. It'll be okay. If you don't step up, it'll be okay. And I'd like to suggest that it's the very last line. It's nothing that he said up until now that matters. It's this last line. Umi yodea im le'et kazot higat lamalchut. And maybe this is why you are here. Esther was chosen seemingly at random to be the queen. Vatilakach Esther, it says, the Gemara points out, she was taken, she didn't really volunteer, she wasn't interested in being the queen. And, she's so beautiful, she's so amazing, everybody likes her, and she's taken to be the queen. And seemingly nobody makes very much of it. No one knows she's Jewish, no one knows much about her, which is itself strange. Achashverosh isn't interested in knowing much about his queen, where she's from, what her nation is. You have to remember that Achashverosh's first wife is Vashti, who's a granddaughter of Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar was the previous Babylonian king. Gets back into the political scheme that Achashverosh, trying to establish a new Persian empire, marries a descendant of the Babylonian Empire to try to solidify political relations, because, as we know from later in history, what better way to create alliances than to marry each other? And now he's not interested at all in who she is? Fascinating. But it wasn't coincidental, is what Mordechai is telling Esther. Mordechai is telling Esther, don't think that things happen at random. God is running the show. And he put you here. And he made you the queen. And maybe, because Mordechai doesn't know, because we never understand exactly why HaKadosh Baruch Hu does things. And he says, Umi Yodea. And perhaps this is the moment that HaKadosh Baruch Hu put you in this position for. Because nothing happens at random. There's Yad Hashem in everything. And when Esther realizes that maybe, just maybe, that Yad Hashem is here, and she is the queen, not because of how she looks, and not because of how she behaved, or not because the other women just didn't cut it, but she's here because HaKadosh Baruch Hu put her in that position. When she realizes that Hashem is running the show, she realizes now she has to rise to the occasion. She learns that lesson and she rises to the occasion. And right after that, she says, you know what? Fine. And if God's running the show, then lech kenoset kol yehudim asher b'Shushan v'tzumu alai v'al tachlu v'al tistu shlosh yamim layla v'yom. Get everybody together and fast for me. Because if it's Hashem running the show, we need his help. And like I said, the Targum Sheni points out there was a mass tshuva movement, brought everybody together in tefillah and tshuva, because they realized that this is an opportunity. They have a woman on the inside, and Hashem put that into place. And Esther learns this lesson, or internalizes this lesson, twice more throughout the story when she realizes that Hashem is really running the show. One point is, and I make the suggestion, that she switches plans in the middle of the night, in the middle of her approach. If you ever thought about it, the Gemara asks, why did Esther create these two feasts? She ends up inviting Achashverosh to a party. And at the first party, she says, you know what? Come to the second party. What's she trying to do? And at the second party, she's like, oh, Achashverosh, there's this terrible person who wants to kill me. It's Haman. She could have done that at the first party. Why didn't she do that at the first party? And I'd like to argue that because her plan was very different. And in fact, I argue in the Sefer, based on, there's the Manos HaLever, so Al-Kabetz quotes Mepharshim right like this, that Esther had a problem. Esther couldn't get Achashverosh to change the decree, because Achashverosh really liked Haman. Haman was a rising star in the Persian political empire. And she couldn't just come out and be like, hey, you're number two in command. He's doing something bad. Stop him. Achashverosh would never listen to her. He'd side with Haman. So she needs to come up with a way that Achashverosh will not want Haman to succeed. And the only way to not want Haman to succeed is if Achashverosh views Haman as a threat. Now, why would Achashverosh view Haman as a threat? Haman was the loyal minister. He's been loyal from Perek Aleph. He's the one who helped him get rid of Vashti in such a way to prevent a rebellion. There's a lot going on there, but he elevates Haman. He keeps promoting him. He likes Haman. Why would he ever listen to Esther to get rid of him? Because she has to convince Achashverosh that Haman's an enemy, that Haman does not have Achashverosh's best interests in mind. And what she does is she tries to convince Achashverosh that she and Haman are having an affair. And if you think about it, if Achashverosh thinks that Haman and Esther are having an affair, then he needs to get rid of Haman. Because that can't be. It's not that Achashverosh is loyal, it's that he's ambitious, and a little bit too ambitious. And that's why she invites him to this private party. And that's why she tries to plant in Achashverosh's mind something that doesn't happen. And when Haman shows up in the middle of the night prancing around the palace, Achashverosh can't sleep. Yeah, that's what Achashverosh is thinking. He's not thinking that Haman is there to see him. Then why out Haman the next day? What changed? Because you know what changed? That night, the king couldn't sleep. And the Gemara in Megillat tells us, Malko Shel Olam. That's when the story of the Nace begins. That's the story of Tokbo Shel Nace. There's even one opinion in the Gemara that you don't even have to read the whole Megillah. You have to start from Parak Vav. Balayla Hahun at the Dashnat HaMelech, because that's where the miracle happens. And even in some Ashkenazi communities, they have the minute to read HaMelech, that HaMelech, with the Nigun of Yamim Noraim. To emphasize HaMelech, it's the Malko Shel Olam, because that night everything changes, because that night Haman wants to kill Mordechai. And that morning, Haman is parading Mordechai throughout the city. Haman, who came to tell Achashverosh, I know that the Jews are all going to die in 11 months, but this Mordechai guy, I can't stand him. He needs to be gotten rid of tomorrow, not in 11 months. I can't deal with him. He needs to be gotten rid of tomorrow. And what happens instead, Haman doesn't even get to talk. But the whole story is flipped around. Now, Haman is parading Mordechai through the city. Of course he can't ask Achashverosh to kill Mordechai. Of course he can't do it anymore. He sees everything is flipped, and Esther realizes that everything's flipped, and one other person realizes that everything's flipped. Very strange person to be one of the few to have a statement of faith in the Megillah, and that's Zeresh, Haman's wife. After Haman parades Mordechai throughout the street, he comes home, Avel v'chafui rosh, in a terrible mood, and Zeresh tells him, Im mizera Yehudim, Mordechai asher achilot elin polefanav, lo tuchalo. If this Mordechai character is Jewish and your whole plan is falling apart piece by piece, Zeresh is saying, now she doesn't have the language to say this because she's not a mamin, something here is amiss. There is something going on, Haman, and something is in charge, and it's not you. She recognizes that there's a plan afoot, that something is changing in the world, that Haman's in the downfall, and she says, there's too many things going on. You are going to lose. In the middle of that conversation, Haman is whisked away to the party, and Esther realizes something changed that night. And she changes her plan that night also. She changes her plan that night because she realizes that Hashem's hand is happening, that it's succeeding, and Hashem changed what's happening. Now Mordechai is on top, Haman's at the bottom, and so the plan needs to change, and she realizes it. She realizes it the next day because both clearly her and Mordechai think that once Haman is gone, the decree against the Jews will fall by the wayside. That's obvious because they come to the king after Haman is gone, and they're like, no, what about the Gzeira? And he's like, well, I killed Haman, and I gave you his house. What else do you want? And Mordechai and Esther sort of look at him like, what do you mean? Killing Haman was great, and giving us his house and his estate, all wonderful, thank you. We're grateful. But the whole point was the decree. And Achashverosh is like, what do you mean? I can't revoke the decree. And now Esther also steps up. Now she cries, and now she's much more forthright with him, and there's no pretense. The story changes. She steps up and realizes that now she needs to take a step because she realizes that Hashem's hand is at play, that things are changing. You see the Jews do it later. I try to show throughout the Sefer that this is what the story of the Megillah is about, not just for us to take away that Hashem runs the world and to see it in everything we do, but that the characters of the Megillah themselves learned this lesson. And that the way we learn this lesson is by seeing it in small things. Yes, to see the story of the Megillah from a bird's eye view, we see that God's running the show. But put yourself in their shoes. Put yourself in the Jews of Shushan's shoes at the time. Small things that happen, it's easy from the bird's eye view to see, but when you're living it, can we see it? That's how we need to learn. That the point of the Megillah, the point of Purim, so much about Purim is all about recognizing the Yad Hashem in the world in the little things. Because when we get used to seeing it in the little things, in the silly little things, that I managed to show up in time and I was the 10th person for a minyan, and I managed to be right there and I can help that person, I managed, all these little things, when we get used to seeing it, we start seeing it more and more and more and more and more. And the lesson of the Megillah, the lesson of Purim, is that these things are hidden. These things are hidden in the world, and it's our job to take them out. And that's why Purim is the story of accepting Torah Sheba'al Peh, because back in the day, Torah Sheba'al Peh couldn't be seen. Torah Sheba'al Peh was oral. Torah Sheba'al Peh, Torah Shebechsav is written. Anyone can check it up. Anyone can look at it and access it. But if you try to practice Judaism by Torah Shebechsav, it's going to be very dry. It's going to be very technical. You're missing the flavor. You're missing the background. You're missing that which gives it chiyus, that which gives it life. That's the Torah Sheba'al Peh. But you can't see it. It wasn't to be written. It was spoken. It existed behind the scenes. You have to search it out. You can't see it. You have to look for it and try to find it. It's Hashem hiding behind the scenes. He's hiding behind those interactions. We have to interact with people to see the Torah Sheba'al Peh. And when we see that Torah Sheba'al Peh, it puts the whole picture in mind. It takes all of Judaism and makes it one big structure. Torah Shebechsav seems very isolated and technical, and it's very hard to live a rich Jewish life that way, and we're not meant to. We're meant to live it through Torah Sheba'al Peh. So when the Jews learned this lesson, to see the Yad Hashem in the world, to see God as behind everything, that was their acceptance of Torah Sheba'al Peh, because that's the lesson of Purim, to see God hiding everywhere where he might be, because he's hiding in plain sight, and it's our job to continue to find him wherever he might be. So thank you very much. The Sefer should be available on Amazon as of tomorrow. Again, snow allowing. And this was really amazing. It's such a wonderful silver lining of the pandemic, if we could say that, to be able to share Torah from such a distance and to be able to learn together. So thank you very much. I'm happy to take some questions. Don't want to hold anybody hostage longer than they need to stay, but however you want to run it.
If you want to ask a question, just unmute yourself. If you need help with doing that, let us know.
Alternatively, if you want to reach out privately, everybody running this has my email address. You can send an email. You can, if you have constructive criticism about the book, feedback, I'd love to hear it. And maybe for next, it probably won't get any changes in for this Purim. But for next Purim, Yirtzeh Hashem, I'm happy to incorporate any, hopefully constructive type of criticism.
Okay, anybody have any questions?
Yeah, I have a question.
Sure.
So what do we see now that Eretz Yisrael is back on its feet? What nisim do we see that we could create as a great example of the Hashem revealing himself to us today in this generation?
Meaning, it wouldn't be me to say, but Rabbi Soloveitchik has the most amazing book of Kol Dodi Ofek, where he effectively says, we see God's hand knocking on the door 5 different places. I mean, the existence of the state of Israel is just something that, we take it for granted. We take it for granted, but just the existence that we have the ability to do that. I think and again, this is me transitioning to my other hat, but that Israel is leading the world in vaccinating its citizens. Israel is leading the world in setting an example to how to protect society, that they spent more money per capita than anyone else to take care of all of its citizens, and they're doing it efficiently and effectively. To me, that's Yad Hashem in the world. That sets us as an Or Lagoyim. That sets up, we need to be proud of that. And we need to teach that. We need to say, those are our values. Our values are, this is what we, and these are nisim v'niflos, that it works, that we've accomplished this, that it works, that it's happening. But I'm looking, when I mean this, I'm telling you that I write this in the book. And this was something that Rabbi Eli Mansour mentioned years ago when he came to BRS. He spoke one Friday night. He said he does this at his Shabbos table, and now we do it every week. We go around the table, everybody finds a Yad Hashem that they experienced that week. Now, it's not earth-shattering. We're talking about like small things, like I made a minion. My son, this was crazy. They were filming a video for school, and they want to film a football catch because there's no sports happening. So they filmed the football catch to pretend that it was like a real sports thing. And they're filming, and it's only one kid throwing the ball to the other, and he fell into the mud. And so he goes to school 2.5 minutes away. So he drives home to change. And it turns out that I had a levaya to go to, so now I had a car to go. Okay, small little thing. We're not talking about earth-shattering things. But the point is, and this was Rabbi Mansour's point, the more you look for it, the more and more you see it. And the more and more you see it, you see when things happen, we need to learn from it. We need to grow from it and react.
Anybody have any questions? Okay, I'd like to thank Rabbi Shabtai for a very interesting and informative new approaches to looking at the Megillah. Thank you so much. We wish
My
everybody-
pleasure. I wish everyone a Freilich and Purim, Chag Purim Sameach, and Bezrat Hashem. It should be the last time we have to celebrate in this type of a way, and we should be able to be, instead of Am Mefuzer Mefurad Bein Ha'amim, Bezrat Hashem, we could be Knosset Kol Yehudim in the future, everybody together in the more simcha type of a way.
We'll say amen to that. Thank you again.
My pleasure. Have a wonderful, wonderful evening. Stay safe and happy Purim.
Thank you. So inspiring.
My
And
pleasure.
mazel tov on your book. We're
Thank
looking